Welcome back to Close Up on our extended interview with Senator Jeanne Shaheen. Let's get right back into the questions. And Senator, let's start out with the First in the Nation primary. Obviously, the fight continues and probably will for some time, but top Democrats are getting behind this effort to write in President Joe Biden's name on the ballot because he didn't sign up there at the Secretary of State's office. Is it a little awkward to have to do all this legwork for somebody who's trying to take away the cherished tradition of the Granite State?
Well, like other people in New Hampshire, I was so disappointed when the DNC, and angry really, that the DNC ruled the way they did about the New Hampshire primary. I was disappointed that the president has said he's not going to be on the ballot here. I hope that as he's looking at the general election, he will focus more on New Hampshire, and I think this grassroots initiative is good because it keeps people engaged in the process, and that's really important.
There's this new candidate, Congressman Dean Phillips of Minnesota, running for president here. South Carolina Democrats have been attacking him, saying that his focus on New Hampshire, they're portraying it as a kind of racial insult to South Carolina, essentially saying that, you know, under the DNC rules as they are, if you're here, you're paying too much attention to, I guess, not one of the what they would say is the important voting blocks. Very poisonous kind of attack here. Can the First in the Nation primary on the Democratic side survive that kind of attack?
Well, I think so, because I think we have voters who are engaged, who pay attention to what's going on and go see all the candidates. And I think that's healthy. That's part of what the New Hampshire primary is all about. It's about bringing candidates into living rooms, into diners, and having to answer tough questions from voters who really know what's going on. And it's unfortunate that it's become about something else other than how do we vet candidates to find the best person to run for president.
You're a veteran of the 1980 campaign primary in which Ted Kennedy challenged sitting President Jimmy Carter. Obviously, Congressman Phillips is no Ted Kennedy, but there's a thing that happens when we see these challenges, and it tends to be that it's an indicator that the sitting president is in trouble. Do you see this Phillips candidacy as an indicator, or should the Biden administration see it as an indicator that he's in trouble next November?
Well, I think it's, I have never met Dean Phillips. I don't know him. What he says is he thinks that there are other voices that need to be heard. So again, that's what the presidential selection process is all about. I support President Biden, and I hope that he's going to focus on New Hampshire when we get to the general election. I wish he were on the ballot now.
On Friday, the president was in Maine, next door, trying to help with the healing process after the mass shootings there. We know the debate over guns in Washington is pretty well stuck, and people are in their trenches, and things probably aren't going to change anytime soon. Is it time to try a new approach on policy? Any new ideas, or is the idea that whatever you propose is just going to be opposed?
Well, as you know, last year we did pass the first gun safety legislation in 30 years, which addresses mental health. There's significant funding available to help address mental health issues. It did put in some background checks, particularly for younger citizens, to prevent them from getting guns when they're not of age. But clearly there are still huge holes in the system, as we saw in the shooting in Maine, where people did seem to identify the shooter as a problem, and yet that still didn't address getting him the help he needed and prevent those awful killings. You know, as I voted for an assault weapons ban, I don't think people need assault weapons to go out and go hunting. I think we've got to limit the size of magazines. There's no reason why anybody needs to have the ability to fire 100 rounds in, you know, a few seconds in ways that are only designed to kill people. So I think we've got to look at a whole range of things, and we know that comprehensive background checks are the most effective way to address gun safety.
When you talk about an assault weapons ban, obviously there are thousands of AR-15s out there privately owned. What would be the answer about what to do about those guns that are already out there? Is the idea confiscation or a robust buyback program? Or
that's been one of the challenges in trying to get something done. And there have been some efforts that have been successful. Buyback programs have been very successful in certain communities. So I think it's one of the things we've got to look at. But to do nothing and to continue to do nothing when we've had over 500 mass shootings this year alone, and it's not even the end of the year, is just not acceptable.
Right, and you've been in touch with the New Hampshire electorate over decades. Something like this, talking about an assault weapons ban, that was the third rail of New Hampshire politics back in the 1990s. How have you seen the people change on this issue over time?
I have, but you know, even from the time when I was governor, most hunters here, most gun enthusiasts wanted common sense rules around gun safety, because they understand, first of all, the safety challenges. You know, the numbers of people we have who die by suicide every year are just staggering because of their ability to go out. I have a good friend whose husband went out one morning, bought a gun, came home in the afternoon and shot himself because he was taking a substance that caused depression and anxiety. So there are a whole range of things that we need to do, and most people who are responsible gun owners understand and want to participate in that.
Let's shift to the northern border. There's been a lot of talk about illegal crossings up here in New Hampshire, and really you've been trying to lead the charge to get some data about exactly how many illegal crossings are happening. You were just urging the Homeland Security Director to provide that information. Why is it so hard to figure out for them how many people are crossing here?
Boy, you got me. I find it really frustrating. You know, right now what they do is they lump all of the Swanton sector, which goes from New York to the Maine border and includes New Hampshire and Vermont. Right now they lump in together the crossings in Vermont and New Hampshire. But we identify them independently, so we could disaggregate that information. And why CBP is not willing to do that is something that is not acceptable, and we're going to keep on it until we get that information, because we can't fully address the problem until we know the extent to which it's an issue, and that's why that kind of data is important.
Do you think that's an indicator that perhaps the number is significant, or is this just sort of bureaucratic ineptitude and they're trying to figure things out?
I don't know. You know, my axiom is always never attribute to malice what can adequately be explained by incompetence. So it's not clear, but that's why we need to keep on it, and we need to get that information, and we need to address very legitimate challenges. I was up at the border this summer, and one of the things I heard was about the communication challenges, which have been a problem since Carl Draga went on his killing spree when I was governor, when we couldn't communicate because we didn't have the cell signals, we didn't have radio communication. We need to fix that. I mean, it's not acceptable that we still have that problem. We need to work with Canada. We need to make sure that people can communicate with each other. That's an important step. We also need to address those border agents who have been called to the southern border. We need to get them back in the northern border. One of the things that is part of that supplemental budget request to address Syria and, Israel and Ukraine is funding for the border, and I intend to work to see if some of those dollars can't go to the northern border.
And obviously the border is a huge issue right now, and we see more of these mayors of large democratic cities, Chicago, New York, calling out for help to the federal government, saying we're being overwhelmed by this migrant crisis of people just coming up. And so I'm just curious, why can't something get done? What is the obstacle to ensure that this flow of humanity can at least be stemmed in some way to avoid a growing crisis?
Well, it needs to be done, and I think we know some of the things that work. Back during the Obama administration, when we saw a surge from Central America, we worked with El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala to address the issues they had on the ground and significantly reduce the flow of immigration. And it's a particular issue when we have legal immigrants who are coming into the country who we want to come in and settle, and we have a workforce shortage in New Hampshire and across this country where we know that there are jobs for those legal immigrants. So we ought to be able to address what's happening at the border.
This is an issue that's always been important to you as a grandmother of a kid with type 1 diabetes. Obviously, the cost of insulin, this is something you've been trying to address for a long time. Some things have been passed, but for people who are uninsured, it's still an exorbitant cost. Has there been any progress? What's going to happen next on this issue?
Well, we made slight progress. We capped out-of-pocket expenses for people on Medicare at $35 a month last year, but Senator Collins and I have legislation that would do that for everybody on their insurance. We have, there's an effort to address uninsured as part of that. What we saw from the American Diabetes Association's report that came out, they do a report every 5 years, it came out last week, is that the cost of insulin has tripled in the last 10 years. And we have 37 million people who have diabetes in this country. We have got to do something to address those costs. That's what our legislation would do. It would expedite the ability for biosimilars or generic insulin to get to the market, which is also important in reducing costs. And most important, we have on the horizon a cure for diabetes. You know that Lonza and a company from Cambridge, Mass. Called Vertex just partnered. I was at a groundbreaking in Newington this summer for that partnership. They're going to do islet cell therapy, which is showing huge promise to cure diabetes. We already have people in clinical trials. We have a person walking around who has been insulin-free for 3 years. But until we get to that point, we've got to help people with the cost.
Last question, very quick here. We're heading into an election year, and after that, you're going to have to make a decision about what you're going to do in 2026. I know that's a long way off. Is there any more allure to retirement in 26 than there was in 20, which wasn't at all, really?
Oh, I'm not going to even talk about that, Adam.
All right.
We've got a lot of people who are up for election next year. We've got mayor's races coming up next week in New Hampshire. We got a lot of work to do first.
All right, we'll check in probably in 2025, I guess.
Okay,
All right, thank you, Senator. Appreciate it.
Nice
and we'll be right